Okay, we're in Haftarah Korah, 1 Samuel 11, verse 14 through 12:22. Now, this Haftarah takes place at the end of the era of the judges. At this time, Israel doesn't have a king, so the monarchy hasn't begun. Now, for this lesson, I'm going to focus on one small thing. I'm going to focus on the idea that the elders of Israel say, we want a king like the nations around us. Okay? So you're going to get a little bit of ancient Near East, or A&E, context in this lesson. Because I think that unless you know a little bit what it means to have a king from the ancient perspective, you might impose your modern understanding of kingship onto this text. And I think then you're going to miss what I believe is an important lesson. So those of us in the United States, we don't really have a good concept, a good grasp of even kingship in modern times. Those of you from Great Britain, you know, the king, or I guess in that case the queen, is maybe more of a figurehead. But in order to understand what it really meant for Israel to ask for a king, like the nations around them, we need to have a little bit of an understanding of what the kings of the nations did back then, how the people related to the kings, and how the kings related to the gods in ancient times. Okay? So if you have ever wondered just what was it that was so sinful for Israel to ask for a king in 1 Samuel, hopefully this will give you a little bit of insight. Little disclaimer here, there's so much more to this subject. To keep this lesson, you know, in the time parameters that I usually like to do, I'm going to be super simple and super basic with it. So if you're interested in this and want to learn more about it, let me know and I can get you some resources to really dig in, because it's fascinating. So I'm going to give you a little brief review of political life in ancient Israel that's up to this point of the Haftarah. Okay, so the point in the Haftarah that we are is where Saul becomes Israel's first king at the request of the people. Okay, so before the establishment of the monarchy, each tribe had judges who administered Torah law on their own. There was no central government, right? The whole book of Judges kind of describes this tumultuous period in time. And I think that before we've talked about this cycle of God's intervention during the period of the Judges, when the tribes and the judges were not walking according to Torah, when they practiced idolatry and they mixed the pagan with the holy, then God would allow heathen nations that were around them to rise up to oppress them. And his purpose in doing this was always redemptive. It was always to wake the people up and encourage them to return to God and his ways. Okay? So the oppressing nations, the heathen nations, they were used to get the people to return to trusting God, to get the people to return to covenant faithfulness. Faithfulness to the one who has shown himself nothing but faithful time and time again. And so with the cycle, when the people cried out to God for deliverance from oppression from these nations, God would respond. But pay attention here. The people would cry out to God, and then God would raise up a man or a woman to serve for a short period of time. And these judges weren't perfect. In fact, they were very much not perfect. It's almost as if he chose the ones that he chose to kind of underscore the idea that they're being used by God, but in fact, it's God who's delivering them, not that person. Okay? Now, this is key to understand and key to remember as we go through the rest of this. So the deliverers that would be raised up by God, they were short term, and they delivered the people only when the people cried out to God. Okay, so it's like these heathen nations that were rising up. It was like they were a check engine light for how people were handling their covenant with God. So there was this ebb and flow of peace, prosperity, not so much, that was directed by God. Okay? It was out of the hands of the people. They didn't have any control over it. And because of this system of God raising up judges, there was often a hole in the leadership on like a regular basis. So under this system where God is supreme ruler and supreme deliverer, the power of the judge or the deliverer was very, very limited, right? And in this system, it was easier for the people to recognize that God was in fact the real power, and that was the beauty of the system. But in order for that system to work as intended, the people had to accept God as the real power. So this is the state of things in the Haftarah. Once again, they're in that part of the cycle where a heathen nation rises up. Okay. Now, in this case, it's the Ammonites, and the king of the Ammonites is named Nahash. Now, Nahash in Hebrew means serpent, so that fact of his name shouldn't be lost on us. So what's happening is that Samuel, who's the current judge, he's getting older. And it's recently been found out that his sons, who maybe the people thought were the natural heirs to him, that the sons are corrupt. So the people know, based on past history, that they're going to have to wait for God to raise up a deliverer, right, under God's system of governance. And no one knows who that's going to be. So with the serpent rising, the people decide to reject this theocratic system that I just outlined, which is unique to Israel. Remember that, okay, for later. And the people are no longer willing to live under that system. They want a human king to help them in battle. We'll talk more on that in a minute. Now, even before the people ask for a king, Samuel earlier chapters has been warning Israel that seeking a king like those of the nations actually represent a deliberate rebellion against God. He's already pointed out that God is their supreme king. Okay? So, are you ready to find out why asking for a king like the nations was so wrong? Is having a king wrong? No. What was wrong was replacing the character of God as he proclaimed that he was, replacing that with the image of the gods of the time. Now I'll explain that in a minute. So by asking for a king like the nations around them, they were asking for something specific. They were asking God to respond to them like the heathens around them responded to their gods, and like the gods responded to the heathens. Okay? So to see this, we need to dig into ancient Near East culture just a little bit, okay, to kind of set the background. So over and over again in Torah, we see that God goes to really great lengths to contrast himself with the gods of the day. And one of the differences that he wants us to understand has to do with divine and human relationships, okay? And he wants us to know that the relationship that he offers us is fundamentally different from how the ancients related to their gods. So in order to know that, you have to understand how the ancients related to their gods. And again, so much more can be said about this, but I'm gonna go super basic here. So the ancient Near East religions all centered around the idea that gods had various needs: food, clothing, thirst, drink, housing, right? And that the people their belief was that people were created specifically to meet the needs of the gods. Okay, isn't that interesting? So sacrifices in the ancient Near East, they were food and drink offered to satisfy the gods, so that in turn the gods would not withhold or withdraw their blessing, and their blessings were of order and prosperity that they gave the humans so the humans could then take care of them. Okay? Now, in the research literature, this is called the Great Symbiosis. It's a codependent relationship between the humans and the gods. Sacrifices gave what the gods needed, and the gods would suffer if the sacrifices were not given, if they were withheld. Okay? So humans had an ability to inflict suffering on the gods, and they could inflict suffering on the gods if they didn't give them the sacrifices that they needed to sustain them. And this ability to inflict suffering kind of gave humans leverage to negotiate with the gods and compel the gods to do what the humans wanted. Isn't that crazy? And often what the people wanted was for the gods to give divine protection against the people's enemies and ask the gods for military power against the enemies. And so the people knew that they could manipulate the gods to do their bidding. The other interesting thing was that as long as the needs of a particular god was being taken care of by the people, that god didn't have any use for the people otherwise. It was just, all I want from you is that you feed me, basically. So much so that if the humans wanted to feed another god, that god didn't care as long as they got taken care of. So there was no, you serve me only. That's kind of one of the beliefs in the worldviews behind polytheism. So in this system, which was prevalent in the ancient Near East, this is what it means to be, of the nations. The role of the king, it was also the role of officials and priests, but we're going to just focus on the king. The role of the king was to ensure order and stability of the kingdom so that the gods' needs could be taken care of very well, because that then guaranteed the continued favor of the god and blessings of prosperity. And of course, the blessings of prosperity was so you can better feed the gods. Okay? So into this system, God inserts his type of relationship that he says he wants from humans. Okay? God says, no. This is not what I need, and this is not what I want. Right? God does not need to eat. He does not need to sleep. He does not need to drink. He does not need clothing. He does not need a house, right? He does not want that symbiotic, codependent relationship with us. Instead, what he offers us is a covenant relationship. And the way that he introduces it is a concept that the people would have already understood when it came to rulers, and that's of a sovereign, the supreme, and a vassal. So a sovereign king, greater king, and a lesser king. Okay? The sovereign is a supreme leader who's stronger and gives to the weaker, the vassal. And in turn, the vassal gives loyalty to the sovereign. And the loyalty enhances the sovereign's reputation, but the sovereign doesn't need that loyalty. Okay? So just very, very simply, that's the covenant relationship that God has with us. So with God as the sovereign, the ultimate king, then in God's system, the human monarch, the human king, cannot also be king the way that kings were thought of in the ancient Near East. Okay? So God is the emperor, Israel is his vassal, and the human king is acting more like a regent over the vassal state. Israel, in turn, is expected to comply with the terms of the covenant, rely completely on the sovereign, which includes military protection. And for the vassal to seek protection someplace else, that is a direct expression of disloyalty and rebellion. So asking anyone besides your sovereign king to meet your needs as the vassal, that also is an expression of disloyalty and rebellion. So when God says, have no gods before me, or literally have no gods in my face, that's what he's saying. So it takes on kind of a different meaning. So breaking the covenant, sinning, disobeying Torah, these all are expressions of disloyalty and rebellion. So when the leaders of the Haftarah say they want a king like the nations, they're saying that they want to do away with God's conception of himself as our supreme suzerain. And they want to exchange that for the concept that was held by the nations around them, where the earthly king can gain leverage over their gods in some codependent way. So the Israelites were saying that they wanted a king who's able to manipulate God, and specifically when it comes to battle. So in that case, gone would be this God's cycle of using heathen nations to bring Israel to repentance. Now there's, again, a lot more to this, of course, but the bottom line is, like Samuel says, that there's nothing wrong with having a human king as long as the king is faithful to the covenant, the stipulations of the covenant that God made. And as long as the king serves as a faithful vassal to the divine supreme emperor and not an overlord in his own right, like with a divine sponsor like the kings of the nations around them. So it's to God alone that Israel and you and I owe our allegiance and our loyalty and our service. And the stipulations in Torah spell out what loyalty and service look like. Pretty cool. I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah.